The morning came in gray and cold, over the small township of Ranwick, on the planet Ashenvale. A quiet world of red soil and long harvests, where people worked hard and asked very little from the universe in return. Ilara Voss was 24 years old, and she was already under the hood of a broken water pump when the sound started. Low and distant at first, like a machine warming up somewhere far away, but growing with every second that passed, filling the air with a pressure that had no name, but made the birds go silent all at once. She straightened up and looked at the sky. It was empty. Then it was not. 3 Vrethkai dropships cut through the cloud cover like dark blades, long and flat and the color of old iron, with no markings that meant anything to her. And they came down fast, the way something comes down when it does not expect any resistance at all. Ilara had seen images of the Vrethkai on the news feeds that came through the relay station every few weeks. Tall reptilian creatures with flat yellow eyes and thick scaled hides wrapped in black tactical armor. But seeing a picture and seeing the real thing were 2 completely different experiences, and she understood that now in a way she had not before. She wiped her hands on her work rag and stood very still. The dropship settled into the eastern field just past the grain storage buildings, and the loading ramps came down, and they came out. 30 of them, maybe more, moving in clean, organized lines, not rushing, not shouting, not even looking around with much interest, just walking forward with the calm of something that has done this exact thing many times before, and expects it to go the same way it always does. Ilara's mother, Senna Voss, came out of the house behind her. Senna was a small woman with strong, calloused hands and silver at her temples, and she had lived on Ashenvale her entire life. Herself, beam by beam, the year before Ilara was born, and she stood in the doorway now and looked at the dropships with an expression that was not fear, but something older and quieter than fear, something that looked almost like recognition. "Get inside," Senna said. "Mama, get inside, Ilara." But neither of them moved. The Vrethkai reached the storage buildings and began breaking the locks with cutting tools that went through steel like it was nothing, working efficiently, mechanically, completely without anger or cruelty, which somehow made the whole thing worse to watch than if they had been screaming. And Ilara stood in the yard and watched them carry out 3 full seasons of grain reserves and stack it all into the dropships with no more care than loading boxes onto a freight hauler. Then one of them turned and looked at the house. Senna stepped forward off the doorstep and onto the red soil road. "That is ours," Senna said, and her voice did not shake at all. The Vrethkai soldier stopped and looked at her the way you look at a rock sitting in the middle of a path. Not with anger, not with contempt, just calculating the most efficient way past it. It raised one arm. Senna did not move. What happened next took less than 4 seconds, and Ilara would spend the rest of her life trying to make sense of it. Not because it was complicated, because it was not complicated at all, but because it was so simple, and so fast, and so completely weightless from the creature that did it. As if the life of a woman who had built things with her hands for 50 years registered as nothing at all. The Vrethkai fired once. Senna dropped to the dirt road in front of her own house. Ilara was on her knees beside her before she even understood that she had moved, her hands going to her mother's face, her shoulders, pressing everywhere, looking for the thing she could fix the way she fixed. Engines. The broken part. The disconnected wire. The component that just needed the right tool applied at the right angle. But there was no broken part here. Senna looked up at her, and opened her mouth and her lips moved, but no sound came out, and then the light in her eyes went the way a lamp goes when the power cuts. Not slowly, not dramatically, just gone, between one breath and the next, without any of the ceremony that a whole life deserved. Ilara stayed on her knees on the red soil road and held her. The Vrethkai continued loading the dropships behind her. The sky was still gray above her. A wind moved through the grain fields, and they whispered, the way they always did. And the world kept going exactly as it had been going, and none of it understood what had just happened here. It was the sound of Mara screaming that made Alara look up. Her younger sister, 18 years old, dark-haired, always the one laughing at something, was being pulled toward one of the dropships by two Vrethkai soldiers who held her arms with complete detachment. Not violent, just firm and steady. The way you carry something you have already decided belongs to you. "Ilara!" Mara screamed. "Ilara, please!" Ilara lurched to her feet and ran. And she was fast. She had always been fast. But the ramp was already rising, and she hit the side of the ship with both fists, and it did not stop, and it did not slow. And the ramp sealed shut with a deep mechanical sound she felt in her back teeth. She pressed her hands flat against the hull, and looked through the small reinforced porthole glass, and Mara was right there, close enough that Ilara could see the tears running down her face, and the raw fear in her eyes, and the way her mouth was still forming Ilara's name over and over, like a question with no answer. Then the ship rose, and Ilara's hands fell away from it, and she stood in the red soil field, with her mother dead, on the road behind her, and the sky already closing back over where the ships had been, as if they had never come at all, as if 11 minutes was not enough time for a world to end. The township went quiet. Smoke was rising from the northern houses. A dog was barking somewhere she could not see. She stood there for a long time and did not move, and the quiet pressed in from every direction, and she let it because there was nothing else to do. And then something changed inside her chest. Not breaking, not collapsing, more like a bolt sliding home inside a lock. Something clicking into a position it had never been in before. Something without a name that felt very much like the first step of a long walk. She went back to her mother and sat beside her and held her hand. She stayed until the hand went cold. Then she stood. There was a Vrethkai pulse rifle lying on the ground near the storage building, dropped by one of the soldiers during the loading, maybe by accident, maybe because it meant nothing to them to leave it behind. And Alara walked to it and picked it up and turned it over slowly in both hands. She had never held a weapon in her life, but she had spent her whole life picking up broken and unfamiliar things and figuring out how they worked, the weight of them, the logic of their parts, what they were built to do and how. And this was not so different from that. Not really. She checked it the way she checked an engine. Without rushing, without fear. She slung it over her shoulder and looked one last time at the house where she had grown up, at the broken locks on the storage building, at the empty field, at the red soil road, and she did not say goodbye, because goodbye was for things that were finished, and this was not finished. She walked toward the tree line where the Survivor Road began, the one that ran north toward the relay station. There was nothing left behind them. She did not look back. She walked until the house was gone behind the trees, and then she kept walking, because there was nothing behind her now, and everything she had left was somewhere out ahead of her, past the trees and the red hills and the cold gray Ashenvale sky. And she was going to find it. Or she was going to burn the whole road down trying. Ashenvale Station smelled like too many people living in too small a space. Sweat and cooking, and the sharp chemical bite of recycled air running through filters that had not been cleaned in weeks. And Alara walked through its crowded corridors with the Vrethkai rifle slung across her back. And nobody stopped her, because almost everyone she passed had something similar in their hands, or on their shoulders, or strapped to their sides. It had taken her 9 days to reach the station on foot, through the red hills and the long flat stretches of scorched farmland, and 2 river crossings that had no bridges left. And she had eaten very little and slept even less. and somewhere around the fourth day, she had stopped feeling the weight of the rifle, and started to feel it as a part of her. The way a tool becomes part of the hand that carries it long enough. The station was built into the side of a mountain on Ashenvale's northern continent, originally a communication and trade hub. Relay hub, now something between a refugee camp and a resistance base, though calling it a resistance base was generous, because the resistance part was mostly just people being very angry in a very organized space without knowing what to do next. There were thousands of them, farmers and teachers and mechanics and shop owners and dock workers, and one very old woman who had been a nurse for 40 years, and who now ran the station's medical bay with the calm authority of someone who has seen too much to be surprised by anything. All of them displaced, most of them having lost something, some of them having lost everything. In this situation, he sat across from her in a small room with a table between them, and he listened without interrupting, while she told him what had happened to Ranwick, what had happened to her mother, what had happened to Mara. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something she had not expected. "There is nothing we can do about the transport ship," he said. "We do not have the firepower, we do not have the numbers, and we do not have the coordinates of wherever they took the conscripts. Sending people to die on a mission with no information is not fighting back. It is just dying faster." She looked at him. "I am not telling you to give up," he said, leaning forward slightly. "I am telling you that the way forward is slow and careful and not what you want to hear right now. I understand that. But understanding that is what has kept the people in this station alive for 3 years, while every other resistance group that charged forward on. Anger alone got destroyed in the first engagement," she asked. "How many people have you saved in 3 years?" she asked. He did not answer that. "How many systems are human settlements in?" she asked. 14 in this region alone," he said, "but they are scattered, and they do not talk to each other, and we have no coordinated structure that could." "What does this station have for long-range broadcasting?" she said. He went quiet again, this time in a different way. The relay array was in a tower at the station's highest point, a long-range signal transmitter originally built for trade communications that could, theoretically, push a signal across all 14 star systems in the region if someone ran it at full power, and did not care very much about burning out 2 of the secondary emitters in the process. Dren told her no. She went up to the tower anyway, at 2 in the morning, when the technician on duty was a 19-year-old named Pell. Had been awake for 20 hours, and who looked at her when she walked in, and looked at the rifle on her back, and then looked at her face, and decided that saying no was not worth what it would cost him. She sat down at the broadcast console and stared at it for a long time. She had not planned what she was going to say. She had thought about it for 9 days on the road, and the whole time she had imagined herself giving some kind of speech. Something that sounded like the things people said in old war films. Something with rhythm and force and the shape of a call to arms. But sitting in front of the console with the transmitter humming and the signal light going green and 14 star systems of sleeping humans on the other end of that connection, all the prepared words went away. So she just talked. She told them about Ranwick, what it looked like on a normal morning, the red soil and the gray sky, and the way the grain fields moved in the wind. She wanted them to understand that it had been a real place with real people in it before 11 minutes took it apart. She told them about her mother standing in the doorway with her calloused hands and her silver-streaked hair, and the way she stepped out onto the road and said, "That is ours," without her voice shaking at all. Not because Senna was a soldier or a hero, because she was not. Because she was just a woman who had worked hard for 50 years, and did not believe that the things she had built should be taken from her without a word of protest. She told them about Mara's face in the porthole glass. She did not cry while she said any of it, not because she was not feeling it, but because the feeling was so large it had gone past tears into something that had no release valve, something that just sat in the center of her chest and burned steadily like a coal. Then she said, simply and without any decoration at all, "I do not know if we can win. Not know what winning even looks like right now. I only know that my mother is dead on a dirt road and my sister is somewhere I cannot find yet. And the thing that did it spent 11 minutes doing it, and then flew away like we were not worth another second of attention. And I want to know if anyone else is tired of being something that the Vrethkai do not think is worth their attention. So I am asking you, plainly, right now, will you stand and fight?" She clicked off the transmitter. The room was completely silent. Pell the technician was staring at her with an expression she could not read. Dren Holt was standing in the doorway behind her. She did not know how long he had been there, and his arms were crossed, and his face was unreadable, in the way that faces get when someone is working very hard not to show what they are feeling. "You burned out one of the secondary emitters," he said. "You said 14 systems," she said. "Did it reach all?" 14. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Yes." She nodded and stood up from the console, and her legs were shaking. She noticed that now, the way you notice something in your body, only after the thing that was holding it together is finished. She sat back down. They both waited. The relay board in front of her was a grid of signal indicators, small orange lights, one for each active communication channel across the 14 systems. And for a full minute, nothing on it moved, and the silence in the room got heavier with every second that passed, and she started to understand what it felt like to shout into a very large dark space and hear nothing come back. Then one of the orange lights went green, then another, then 5 more at once. Then the board started going green faster than she could count. Not military channels, not government signals, not organized response teams, just people, individual people in 14 different star systems, opening channels and sending back the single word or the short sentence, or sometimes just the unbroken open carrier signal that meant someone on the other end had heard her and was pressing transmit with no idea what to say, but needing to say something anyway. Dren walked slowly to the board and stood in front of it and watched the green lights spread across it and said nothing for a long time. "They are not soldiers," he said finally, and his voice was quiet. "No," Ilara said, "they are not. This is going to be very difficult," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at the board for another long moment and then he turned to her, and something behind his careful, tired eyes shifted, just slightly, the way something shifts in a room when someone opens a window that has been closed for a long time. The first person to arrive after the broadcast was not a soldier. He was a 63-year-old man named Tobias Kren, who had spent 40 years designing atmospheric pressure systems for deep space mining rigs. And he showed up at Ashenvale Station 6 days after Ilara's broadcast, with 3 heavy duffel bags full of tools and a battered notebook filled with diagrams that he had been sketching for 2 years, quietly, alone in his workshop on a colony called Veth Minor, because he had always believed the Vrethkai would push too far eventually, and he had always believed someone would need what he had been thinking about. He sat down across from Ilara and Dren at the planning table and opened his notebook and pushed it across to them and said, "I have been working on something." What Tobias had been working on was a way to reverse the function of a Vrethkai shield emitter, the devices the Vrethkai used to protect their dropships and ground vehicles from incoming fire, so that instead of projecting a defensive field outward, it would collapse inward and create a localized electromagnetic disruption strong enough to shut down any Vrethkai electronic system within 40 meters. He had never built a working version because he had never had a captured Vrethkai emitter to work from. Ashenvale Station had 4 of them, pulled off destroyed Vrethkai vehicles from the raid 3 months prior, sitting in a storage room because nobody had known what to do with them. Tobias had a working prototype in 11 days, built mostly from mining equipment parts and 2 components he fabricated himself using the station's metal shop. And when he tested it in the Eastern Equipment Bay, it shut down every electronic device in the room, including the lights and Dren's earpiece, and the medical monitor running in the room above it. And everyone stood in the sudden dark silence for a moment, and then someone started laughing, and then everyone was laughing. Not because it was funny, but because it was the first time in a very long time that something had gone right. The second person to arrive was not a soldier either. She was 17 years old, and her name was Kess, and she had grown up on a farming colony called Durrell's Rest, where the only entertainment was the planetary data network, which she had been quietly dismantling and reassembling for her own amusement since she was 9 years old. She had heard Alara's broadcast on her father's long-range receiver, and she had packed a bag and told her father she was leaving, and he had looked at her for a long time, and then hugged her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would have been more than what that hug already said. Kess arrived at Ashenvale Station and walked directly to the communications room and sat down, and within 4 hours had done something that the station's 3 trained communications officers had been trying to do for 2. She cracked the Vrethkai encrypted troop movement channel. It was not that the encryption was easy. It was not. It was that the Vrethkai had designed it to resist the kinds of decryption methods that organized military intelligence services used, and they had never considered the possibility of a 17-year-old who had grown up treating data networks as toys, and who approached the problem not like a trained cryptographer, but like a child taking apart a toy to see what was inside it. She handed Dren a printed transcript of Vrethkai troop movement orders for the next 30 days, and he read it twice, and then looked at her and said, "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" And she said, "Since I was 9. He did not say anything else, because there was nothing useful to add to that. More people kept coming. A field medic named Sora, who had been working in the outer colony hospitals for 12 years, discovered, working with samples from Ashenvale's native plant life, a compound that neutralized the Vrethkai nerve toxin that had been responsible for more than half of the human casualties in ground engagements. She had been researching it in a personal capacity for a year and a half, with no funding and no institutional support, working in the evenings after her regular shifts, because it had seemed like an obviously important problem that nobody else appeared to be solving. A former cargo hauler pilot named Wick, who had flown the same trade route between 3 colony worlds for 15 years, turned out to have an instinctive understanding of orbital approach vectors that made Dren's best tactical planners look at each other and then look at him, and then stop asking where he had trained, because the answer was clearly nowhere formal, and the question was making him uncomfortable. They were not an army. They were something stranger than an army, and in some ways more difficult to manage. Follows orders, and these people followed logic. They followed the problem in front of them. They followed their own understanding of what needed doing, and coordinating them required not giving commands, but asking questions, and then getting out of the way while they answered those questions in ways nobody had anticipated. Dren found this deeply uncomfortable at first. He had spent 20 years in a military structure where the chain of command was the chain of command, and people did their assigned jobs in their assigned ways, and the value of that system was predictability. You knew what you had, you knew what it could do, you could plan around it. And what was growing in Ashenvale Station was not predictable at all, and could not be planned around in any conventional sense. But Ilara watched him adapt, slowly, in the way that a careful and intelligent person adapts when the evidence in front of them is strong enough, not abandoning his experience, but layering it over. Something new, using what he knew about tactics and supply lines and force projection to build a structure around the strange and disorganized brilliance that kept arriving at the station's doors with duffel bags and notebooks and ideas that should not have worked. On the other side of the star system, a Vrethkai intelligence officer named Sethvar was filing reports that were making his superiors very tired of hearing from him. Sethvar was methodical, in the way that the best Vrethkai officers were. Patient, precise, rigorous. And what he was seeing in the human activity patterns coming out of Ashenvale did not match the models his command structure used to classify humanity as a low-priority, pre-unified species incapable of coordinated resistance. He filed his first concern report 3 weeks after Alara's broadcast. It said, in the careful language of Vrethkai military intelligence, "The humans are organizing in a non-standard pattern that does not correspond to known species behavioral models under occupation pressure. Recommend reassessment of threat classification." His superior read it and sent back a single line, "Monitor and report. No action required." He filed a second report 2 weeks later, when Kez cracked the troop movement channel. He did not know how it had happened. Only the human operatives were now reading Vrethkai communications with a speed and accuracy that should not have been possible for a species at their technological level. His superior told him he was over-calibrating his concern. He filed a third report when a Vrethkai equipment depot on Ashenvale's southern continent was hit by a small human ground team using a device that shut down every electronic system in the facility, and walked out with enough weapons and power cells to supply a significant ground force. This time his superior did not respond at all. Seth Var sat in his monitoring post and looked at his screen. Read back through all 3 reports, and then looked at the growing shape of what the humans were building, and wrote one more line in his personal log. Not an official document, just a note to himself, in his own language, that translated roughly as, "These creatures do not behave the way cornered things are supposed to behave." He saved the note and went back to watching. 6 weeks after Alara's broadcast, the makeshift fleet assembled in Ashenvale Station's upper docking ring for the first time. 14 vessels in total, none of them built for combat. All of them modified in ways that their original manufacturers would not have recognized or approved of. Cargo haulers, with Tobias's shield disruptors bolted to their hulls. Mining vessels with their drill arrays reconfigured as forward-facing energy projectors. 2 atmospheric shuttles that Wick had personally modified for orbital maneuvering with a level of precision that had no right to work as well as it did, stood on the observation deck and looked at them through the long, transparent wall. And they looked exactly like what they were. Ugly and mismatched, and held together in places by solutions that had been invented last week, by people who had never built warships before. She thought about Mara. She decided it would have to be enough. The intelligence from Kez came through at 4 in the morning. A full set of Vrethkai internal coordinates pulled from their encrypted movement channel, cross-referenced against supply manifests and labor transfer logs. And when Kez laid it all out on the planning table and pointed to the location marked in the outer belt of Ashenvale's own star system, Dren looked at it for a long time without speaking. "Kol Dar," Kez said. "It is a labor processing station. The Vrethkai use it as a holding and sorting facility for conscript workers before they get transferred to long-range transports. The population data in the supply manifests puts the current human count at somewhere between 6 and 9,000. Alara was already standing when Kez finished the sentence. "Mara could be there," she said. "Yes," Kez said simply, "she could be." Dren put both hands flat on the table and looked at the coordinates and the fleet composition charts and the defensive layout that Kez had pulled from the movement channel. Kol Dar had automated gun platforms on its outer hull, a complement of 40 Vrethkai guards, 2 short-range patrol ships docked at its eastern bay, and shield generators on its 4 primary anchor points. And he did what he always did when presented with a plan that had a real chance of killing everyone involved, which was to be very quiet and very careful and very honest. "This will not be clean," he said. "It does not need to be clean," Alara said. "It needs to work." They launched at dawn with 14 ships and 112 people, and a plan that Dren described, with characteristic honesty, as having a reasonable chance of partial success under optimal conditions, which everyone understood to mean it was the best available option and not a good one. The approach to Koldar took 6 hours through the outer belt, and Alara spent most of it in the forward bay of the lead hauler. Was piloting, sitting on a crate with her back against the hull, and her eyes open and her mind running over the plan again and again, not because she expected to find something new in it, but because keeping her mind moving was the only way she had found to keep it from going to the places she could not afford for it to go right now. Wick flew the way he did everything, without visible effort, with complete attention, his hands on the controls as easy and natural as breathing, making small adjustments in the approach vector every few minutes that no instrument was telling him to make, but that somehow kept the ship perfectly in the blind spot of Koldar's outer sensor sweep, in a way that the station's own designers probably did not know existed. The first sign that something was wrong came when they were 40 minutes out. Sethvar's warning had never reached official Vrethkai command. His superiors had dismissed it 3 times, but it had, through the quiet, informal channels that exist in every military structure, reached a garrison commander named Veth-Or, who ran the Koldar defensive complement. And Veth-Or was the kind of officer who did not need official orders to act on good information. So he had quietly added 2 additional automated gun platforms to the station's outer hull, and repositioned the patrol ships from the eastern docking bay to a wide perimeter patrol pattern. Wick saw the patrol ships first. "They moved them," he said, and his voice was completely level. "The patrol ships are not where the chart said they would be." Dren was in the command position behind him, and he looked at the sensor reading and said, "Adjust the approach. Take us in from below the station's axis. The gun platforms on the lower hull are older models. Tobias said the disruptors should reach them from twice the distance of the newer ones." "Should," Tobias said, from the back of the bay, of a man who had tested his device 11 times, and was about to find out what the 12th result would be. What followed was not a battle the way battles looked in the entertainment feeds. It was not clean, or heroic, or well-lit, and nobody moved through it with the easy confidence of someone who knew how it would end. Wick brought the lead hauler in below the station's axis, and Tobias fired the disruptor array at full output, and 4 of the lower hull gun platforms went dark and dead in 1 second. And then the other 10 ships came in from 3 directions at once, and the noise inside every hull was enormous. The sound of incoming fire hitting modified shields, the sound of return fire going out, the sound of people talking very fast on every open channel at the same time, trying to report a dozen things that were all happening at once. 2 ships took critical damage in the first exchange, and had to fall back. 1 did not make it far enough back. Let herself think about that. The boarding teams breached Koldar's hull on the station's western face, cutting through an access panel that a man named Kale had spent 4 months memorizing from inside the station while pretending to comply with his labor assignment, drawing maps on scraps of material he hid in the lining of his worksuit, because he had heard Alara's broadcast on a contraband receiver and had been waiting ever since for whoever was coming to come. Kale met the boarding team at the interior breach point, and he was thin, and his face was angular from months of insufficient food, and his eyes were very bright, and he said, "I know where they are keeping everyone. Follow me." And then he walked forward without looking back to check if they were following, because he had been waiting too long to slow down now. The interior of Koldar was a maze of sealed bulkheads and narrow service corridors, and the automated defense turrets inside were still active. Moving through them was slow and costly, and there were moments in those corridors that Alara would not be able to put into clear sequence afterward. Moments that existed only as sensations, as noise and light, and the weight of the rifle in her hands, and the sound of Dren's voice on the comm channel, steady and patient, talking a young volunteer named Bryn through manually overriding a bulkhead seal with the exact calm of a man who has decided that his job right now is to be the one steady thing in a situation that has very few steady things in it. They found the labor bays on the lower deck. 6 of them, running the length of the station's southern axis, each one sealed with a coded lock that Kess broke remotely from the lead hauler in under 30 seconds per door, because by this point, Kess breaking coded locks in under 30 seconds was simply what Kess did. Ilara went through the 4th door, and the bay inside was large and low-ceilinged and full of people who had not seen an open door in a very long time, and who looked at the boarding team with expressions that moved through disbelief and fear and something that was not quite hope yet, but was the shape of the space where hope was about to be. She found Mara in the back corner. Mara was sitting against the wall, with her knees pulled up and her head down, and she looked up when she heard Ilara say her name. And for a moment she did not move, and then she was on her feet and across the bay, and the sound she made when she reached Ilara was not a word. It was something older than words. The sound of a person who has been very far away for a very long time, and has just, without being sure it was possible, found the way back. They held each other in the middle of the labor bay, while people moved around them on every side. Ilara did not say anything. She did not need to say anything. Outside Koldar, Seth Var watched the assault from his patrol ship at a distance. Sensor readings showed him the station's defensive systems going down, one by one, and the human ships holding position under fire that should have broken them, and the boarding teams moving through the interior with the kind of purpose that things have when they are not doing this for strategy or for territory, but for something that has no tactical name and no logical framework, and that his people had never found a reliable way to plan against. He watched, and he said nothing, and he filed no report, because there was nothing left to say that he had not already said 3 times to people who had not wanted to hear it. 7,200 people came out of Koldar. The fleet extracted them in 4 hours and turned for home. Nobody celebrated on the ride back. The cost had been too clear and too close for celebration, and everyone on every ship understood, without being told, that what they had done tonight was not an ending, but a beginning. That Vreth Kai would respond, and the response would be serious, and the road ahead was longer and harder than the road behind. But 7,200 people were going home who had not expected to go home. And Mara was sitting beside Ilara on a crate in the forward bay of the lead hauler, their shoulders touching, both of them quiet, watching the stars move past the forward viewport as Wick brought them back through the outer belt toward Ashenvale. And that was enough for right now. That was exactly enough. The rebuilding of Ranwick began on a cold morning, 3 weeks after the raid on Koldar, with 12 people and 2 hand tools between them, and a pile of salvaged timber that someone had hauled in on a flatbed from the next township over. Ilara was one of the 12. She had not planned to be. She had told herself she would go back to the station, that there was work to do there, that Dren needed her at the planning table, and Kess needed a second set of eyes on the new Vrethkai signal patterns, and the fleet needed repairs that only someone with her particular knowledge of engines and mechanical systems could properly oversee. And all of that was true. All of it was real work that genuinely needed doing. But on the morning they were loading the supply haulers to go back, she had found herself standing in the red soil yard of what had been her family home instead, with no memory of deciding to walk there, just standing in the place where her mother had fallen and looking at the dirt road and the broken storage building and the empty field beyond it. Mara had found her there an hour later. They sat together in the ruins of the house, on the floor because there was no furniture left, backs against the one wall that was still fully standing. And they talked about Senna for the first time since Alara had found Mara in the labor bay at Kol Dar. Mara talked about the way their mother used to wake up before everyone else and stand in the kitchen in the dark, drinking her first cup of tea before the day started. Not doing anything, just standing there in the quiet, with both hands around the cup, like she was collecting herself before she went out and gave the day everything she had. Alara talked about the way Senna had looked at the Vrethkai soldiers that morning, not with fear, not even with hate, just with a particular expression of a person who has worked for 50 years and built things that belong to them. On a fundamental level, the idea that those things can be taken without protest. She was not trying to be brave, Alara said. She just genuinely did not believe they had the right. No, Mara said, she did not. They sat with that for a while. The grief did not go away while they sat there, and it did not become easier to hold, and neither of them pretended otherwise. It was large, and it was permanent, and it had the specific weight of something that was going to be carried for the rest of both their lives. Not because they could not survive it, because they clearly could and clearly were, but because Senna Voss had been worth carrying, and they both knew it. After a while, Mara looked around at the broken walls and the open sky where the roof had been, and said, "We should fix this." "Yes," Alara said. "Not just because it is ours," Mara said, "although it is ours." "Yes," Alara said again. They got up and started pulling debris off the ground. Across the galaxy, in the meeting halls of the Interstellar Conclave, the body of alien species that governed interstellar diplomatic relations, and that had spent the past 3 years issuing formal concerns about the Vrethkai occupation of human worlds, while doing nothing that cost them anything. A very different kind of conversation was happening. The raid on Kol Dar had moved through Conclave intelligence channels within days, and the report that landed on the desks of senior diplomatic staff described, in careful neutral language, a coordinated cross-system assault conducted by a species with no formal unified military command, using improvised and retrofitted civilian vessels against a fortified Vrethkai installation, resulting in the successful extraction of over 7,000 prisoners and the neutralization of the station's full defensive complement. The species classified in Conclave records as humanity had been given the threat rating of 7 on a scale of 1 to 100 at their last assessment 3 years prior. Several delegations quietly requested a new assessment. One ambassador, from a species called the Falori, who had been the loudest voices in the conclave for respecting Vrethkai territorial expansion rights, sent a private communication to his home council that contained no formal policy language at all, just a single observation. The humans did this with cargo ships and mining equipment, and the 17-year-old who had never attended a military academy. And they did it in 6 weeks. And I think we have been making a significant error in how we think about this species. The Vrethkai High Command convened a full strategic review for the first time in 11 years. Seth Var was brought before the review panel and formally promoted 2 grades, which in Vrethkai military culture was the equivalent of a significant apology delivered without any actual words of apology, with the stillness of someone who would have preferred to have been wrong. He was given a new assignment. Study the humans. Specifically, study the question of why they did not break under occupation pressure the way the models said they should. Why the standard response pattern of increasing force leading to submission and compliance had produced the opposite result with this species. Why cornering them seemed to make them more dangerous rather than less. He accepted that assignment and began his work, and within his first 2 weeks, he had already noted the thing that he suspected was the core of the answer, which was this. The Vrethkai models for predicting species behavior under pressure were built on the assumption that survival was the primary motivating factor for all intelligent life, and that therefore sufficient threat to survival would produce compliance in any species rational enough to calculate the cost of resistance. But the humans, Seth Var wrote in his notes, did not appear to be calculating the cost of resistance against the cost of survival. They appeared to be calculating the cost of resistance against something else entirely, against the cost of becoming the kind of people who did not resist, against the cost of a world in which what happened to Senna Voss on a dirt road happened without anyone standing up and saying that it should not have happened. That was not a calculation the Vrethkine models had a variable for. He kept writing. Back on Ashenvale, Dren Holt formally registered the resistance organization as the Ashenvale Defense Corps, the first officially recognized human paramilitary structure outside of the home system's own jurisdiction. In a brief ceremony that consisted mostly of Dren signing a document while Kess ate a sandwich and Tobias argued with one of the younger engineers about the best way to improve the disruptor array output by another 15%. More volunteers were still arriving at the station every week. Not all of them were fighters, most of them were not fighters, but that had stopped mattering as a distinction, because the past 2 months had demonstrated clearly enough that the difference between a fighter and a person who fixed things or built things or understood things was not a difference in usefulness, but only a difference in the specific form that usefulness took. They were building something that did not have a clean name yet. Not an army exactly, not a government, not a movement in any organized sense, just a gathering of people who had heard a question asked plainly over a long-range broadcast and had decided that their answer was yes. The relay array tower at Ashenvale Station had become something of a landmark in the weeks since the broadcast. People left things at its base, notes and photographs, and small objects that had personal significance, the way people leave things at the sight of something that changed them. And the technicians who worked in the tower had stopped trying to keep the area clear, because it felt wrong to disturb it. One afternoon, a boy came up to the tower, 12 years old, small for his age, dark, serious eyes, and found a printed transcript of Alara's original broadcast pinned to the wall inside the lower access corridor, left there by someone weeks ago, already slightly worn at the edges from people reading it. He read it slowly from the beginning to the end, and then he stood there for a moment, thinking about it, and then he looked up and found Alara standing at the base of the stairs, because she came here sometimes in the late afternoon when the work allowed it, not for any specific reason, just because it was the place where the thing had started, and sometimes it helped to stand in the place where a thing started. The boy looked at her and said, "Did you win?" She looked at him for a moment. She thought about her mother on the red soil road, and the way the light had gone out between one breath and the next, without any ceremony at all. She thought about Mara's face in the porthole glass of the rising ship. She thought about the ugly mismatched fleet in the docking ring, and Tobias's device shutting out all the lights, and Kess eating a sandwich while history got made, and Dren's patient voice in the dark corridors of Koldar, talking a frightened teenager through a locked door. She thought about 7,200 people going home. "Not yet," she said, "but we answered the question." The boy looked at the transcript on the wall, and then back at her, and nodded, slowly, like someone filing something away for later. Ilara walked back out into the cold Ashenvale afternoon, and went back to work. There was a great deal of work left to do, and she was very good at work, and she was not going to stop.